We're covering the axial skeleton today, so let me share my screen. So the axial and appendicular skeletons are way we divide up the skeletal, the skeleton into different regions. And the axial skeleton is that which is in the blue tinted bones here, right through the center of the body. The appendicular skeleton is going to be everything else. So the axial skeleton is composed of the skull, vertebral column, hyoid, thorax, which is the ribs and sternum, ossicles, studied with special senses. Skull characteristics. Well, most of the bones of the skull are flat. There are certain markings on them, that impart certain functions. So a suture is where bones interlock and unite bones together. We have certain sutures we're going to have to know for lab. Sinuses, or a sinus, is an air-filled cavity in cranial bones lined with mucous membranes that lighten the skull, warm and moistens air, and adds resonance to the voice. A foramen is a hole or opening in bone where a nerve and or blood vessels may pass. And a fontanelle is an area of connective tissue between cranial bones in a fetus that allows the skull to change shape through the birth canal and allows for brain growth. Right, so here we have over to the left-hand side, we can see where some of the major sinuses are located. They are named for the bones in which they're found. So on the frontal bone, we have frontal sinuses. Maxillary bone, maxillary sinus. Sphenoidal bone, which is hard to say, Sphenoidal sinus, and the ethmoid sinus are all respectively found in those bones. Then over to the right-hand side, we can see the fontanelles. Here, right in midline, we have to the front, the anterior fontanelle, to the back, posterior fontanelle, and then off to the sides, we have anterolateral fontanelles, and to the back, posterior lateral fontanelles. We have 8 cranial bones. That includes a frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, an occipital bone, temporal bone, of which there are 2, a sphenoid, Sphenoid, and ethmoid bone, Ethmoid. The frontal bone is found in the forehead region. It forms the anterior margin of the frontal lobes of the brain. Part of it forms part of the eye orbit, and it also contains the frontal sinus. Parietal bones are paired bones to the lateral aspects of the skull, and there are points where the parietal bones connect to other bones, and those form what we refer to as sutures. It's a type of joint, and we have fibrous connective tissue attaching these bones together. The coronal suture is where the parietal bone meets the frontal bone. The sagittal suture is where the 2 parietal bones meet midline. The lambdoidal suture is where the parietal bone meets the occipital bone. And the squamous suture, of which there are two, also one on each side, is where the parietal bone meets the temporal bone. And so this picture of the skull with each bone in a different color helps you identify the location of those sutures. It's also a very excellent source to study from to identify each individual bone. This is from the back of the head where you can see the lambdoid suture. Okay, the occipital bone. It forms the posterior wall and the base of the skull. There are two features to note. One is the foramen magnum, which acts as a passageway where the medulla oblongata can pass through and then continues as your spinal cord. Foramen means whole, and magnum means large. We also have the occipital condyles. These are smooth, rounded projections that form a joint with your first cervical vertebra, called the atlas. And thus, this image of the inferior aspect of the skull helps you identify the location of the occipital bone, the foramen magnum, occipital condyles. And while we're here, it allows you to see some other features, such as the zygomatic process on the temporal bone, the external acoustic meatus, the infraorbital foramen. Right, the temporal bones. They are to each lateral aspect of the skull. There are three features to identify. The external auditory meatus is a passageway for the ear canal, middle and inner ear. The mastoid process, found posterior and inferior to the external auditory meatus, functions as a muscle attachment for neck muscles. Specifically, it will be the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The zygomatic process is a portion of bone from the temporal bone that extends toward your nose. And that part of bone, called the zygomatic process, will contribute to the cheekbone, the arch and cheekbone area. It will connect to another process on the zygomatic bone called the temporal process. Okay, so here we have a picture of the temporal bone. You can see this portion of bone called the zygomatic process. Behind it, the mastoid process and the external acoustic or auditory meatus. The sphenoid bone, it spans the middle portion of the inferior skull. There are two features to identify. We have what's called the sella turcica, which contains the pituitary gland. And then anterior to the sella turcica is a sinus, and that would be the sphenoid sinus. The ethmoid bone is located between the eyes. It forms part of your nasal cavity and forms part of each of the orbits of your eyes. There are two features to identify: the olfactory foramina, which function as a passageway for the olfactory nerves, and the crista galli, that functions as the attachment site of the dura mater to anchor the brain. And so here in this picture of the skull, we're looking down into the skull. The pink bone indicates the sella turcica. The brown bone anterior to that is the ethmoid bone, and it identifies the crista galli right in the center, and to the right and left of the crista galli are the olfactory foramina. We also see, again, the foramen magnum found on the occipital bone. Facial bones. These include the mandible, maxilla, zygomatic, nasal, lacrimal, palatine, vomer, and the inferior nasal conchae. Right, the mandible, which is your jawbone, anchors the lower row of teeth. It is the only skull bone that can move, and it articulates at the temporomandibular joint with the temporal bone. There are three features to identify: the mandibular condyle, sometimes referred to as a condylar process, and that articulates with the temporal bone. The coronoid process functions as an insertion of the temporalis muscle, and the mental foramen, which is a hole, is for the passage of nerves. And so on this picture here, we can see the mandibular condyle or the condylar process, the coronoid process, and the mental foramen. The maxilla bone forms the upper jaw and houses the upper row of teeth. The only feature you have to identify is the infraorbital foramen, which functions as a passageway for nerves. Other facial bones, the zygomatic bone. That is what we refer to as your cheekbone. The zygomatic bone contains the temporal process. It's a portion of bone that is going to extend posteriorly to meet and fuse with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and thus forms your zygomatic arch or your cheekbone. Well, not the cheekbone, but the arch. All right, the nasal bone forms the bridge of the nose. The lacrimal bone is just into the medial aspect of the orbit of the eye. It has a little hole at the base of it, and that's for tears to pass through. All right, so here looking at the anterior aspect of the skull, we can see the nasal bone right in midline. To the right and left in green are the lacrimal bones. We have in light purple the maxilla And the holes in those are the infraorbital foramen, the mandible, which is the jaw. You can see clearly now the mental foramen. And then we move on to the vertebra.